of Corrections and...
Order. The Honourable David Parker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Speaker, who's just resumed his chair, asked what the government did with the Labor government did with our 9 surpluses in a row. We reduced government debt. We ran 9 surpluses in a row. 9. Every surplus, every budget that we ran was a surplus for 9 years in a row. In contrast, it's obviously a matter of great sensitivity on the other side because the score is currently 9-0. Mr Speaker, what did we do with those surpluses? Well, we actually applied them to a range of things like improved educational health services, but we also used a large amount to reduce government debt. Gross government debt was reduced from 40 to 18% of GDP, and net government debt was reduced from roughly 18% of GDP to 0, to zilch, nothing, nada, none was left. So much so that when Bill English inherited the books, one of the first things he said when the global financial crisis hit and he was asked about the state of the government's books, he said this was the rainy day that government is saving for, or has been saving for. I think his exact words were, this is the rainy day that government has been saving for. Mr Speaker, it is true that the budget bounced well for the government on the first day. It's normally the way in respect of budgets, and it was also true of this budget. And why was that? In this case, they had so depressed people's expectations of the budget that they were expecting that their promise in respect of reaching surplus would be broken, and they weren't expecting any money in it whatsoever for the vulnerable. So when the government did announce $25 per week for beneficiary families, people were surprised and gave the government some credit for that, and as Andrew Little has said on our behalf, we give them some credit for that. We make a couple of points. Mr Speaker, if the government is now at the point where at long last it acknowledges that amongst some of our families we have very serious levels of deprivation, and the government's own surveys show that, and in that those measures of deprivation, they include things like quite often not having breakfast or quite often not having lunch, never being able to pay your school fees, sometimes not having shoes or raincoat, those sorts of things. The government now acknowledges that we have that sort of deprivation in New Zealand, and yet the parents of those children have to look them in the eye and say, oh look, in this wealthy country that is New Zealand, that has got a rock star economy, you can't get breakfast until the 1st of April next year. Because this $25 a week does not start till next year. If I contrast that with what the Labor Party plan was at the last election, for low-income families, it was $60 a week for every child for the first 3 weeks of their 3 years of their life. Mr Speaker, I want to turn now to some of the other problems that are becoming clear the longer you look at the budget. We of course now all know that the government's promise of reaching surplus has not been met. We also know that their promise not to introduce new taxes has not been met. We know that there's nothing meaningful to overcome the imbalances or the problems that we've got in housing, particularly in Auckland, where we've got the lowest rate of home ownership since the 1950s. Indeed, one of the centrepieces of the legislation passed following the budget was stopping them getting advice from Housing New Zealand, despite the fact that we've got a crisis in housing in Auckland, and we've also got some terribly substandard housing in other parts of the country, including in the provinces. Mr Speaker, I want to talk a little bit about the areas that relate to my portfolio, which is export growth and trade. Today's figures of merchandise trade, they came out today for April, and they show that for April 2015 compared with April 2014, exports fell by 5.5%. It's a drop of 5.5% year on year. Now, Mr Speaker, this shows up in the forecasts of the government in the external deficit that we have as a country. Now, I know that I've taken many barbs over the years from Bill English saying that I rattle on too often about the external deficit, but the truth is that an economy is a bit like a household budget. And if your economy is leaking money to the rest of the world, it's just like your own family budget leaking money to somebody else. If you don't earn enough money to pay your bills, then at the end of the year, you've either had to sell something or take on debt. And our economy is exactly the same. And as an economy, we do not sell enough in our exports to pay for our imports plus our interest in the dividends that we pay overseas. Now, Mr. Speaker, the current account deficit this year is projected to go to $13.7 billion. It's a huge amount of money. That's an extra $13.7 billion that we owe to the rest of the world, in a combination of debts to the rest of the world and extra amounts that the rest of the world owns of us because we sell more of ourselves to them in order to meet that deficit. Mr. Speaker, it's against that background that you have to ask, what is it that the government has done since they came to power 7 years ago to change the shape of the economy, and how do you judge it? Well, for a start, you would say that one of the ways that you could reasonably judge it is by assessing their progress against the very targets they set themselves. The government came to office saying that we consumed too much in New Zealand, we didn't save enough, and that we needed to increase exports and savings. What's happened? Well, it is true that New Zealand in the last 7 years has saved a little bit more. The vast majority of that actually is insurance receipts that have come in following the insurance claims in Canterbury, following the Canterbury earthquakes, and also when New Zealanders put their checkbooks away because they felt vulnerable in the recession. But it's also true that we are now at the point where we are verging on, if we haven't already crossed over to the point where as a nation we are overall dis-saving. We're overall dis-saving at a household level. And in addition to that, our exports, rather than going up from 30% to 40% of GDP, which was the government's target, they have raced backwards. And I say raced because they started at about 30% of GDP. They got them up to close to 31% of GDP. And since then, our exports as a percentage of the economy have dropped back. A couple of years ago, they went to under 30% of GDP. And now, in the year that we're just having, they're forecast to be 26.4% of GDP. So 7 years after this government came into power to say they were going to increase exports from 30 to 40% of GDP, they've gone back to 26.4% of GDP as predicted. And indeed, they don't, even to the end of the forecast period, which is 4 years out, they don't even get up to 28% of GDP. Now that is a massive fail. What is causing it? Well, as Gareth Morgan says in New Zealand, we are a wealthy country, but we misapply capital. We put our capital in the wrong parts of the economy. We don't save enough because we don't encourage enough savings. And then the capital that we do apply, we apply to the wrong parts of the economy rather than the more productive parts of the economy. And there is no doubt that the biases that we have that encourage that outcome remain. Mr. Speaker, that leads me to KiwiSaver. Now, KiwiSaver has, the incentives for it have been cut. We've last week at great length went through the 8 changes that have been made to KiwiSaver by this national government, 7 of which are cuts, Mr. Speaker. But I could not understand the Prime Minister at question time today when he said that this change will not change savings behaviour. It's just a nonsense. I think all of us know that the days when economics was overrun with statistical formula being reliable are over. Behavioural economics is a very real part of economics, and we know that if you're a young person starting out in your first part-time job, probably earning $50 or $100 a week, and you're only saving a few percent of that and your taxes deducted from that, then the amount of increment to your savings of $2 or $3 a week doesn't seem much. And it would almost seem like you're not going to give up much if you don't do it. And so a lot of people won't. If you've already got $1,000 in your account from a kickstart from the KiwiSaver account and it's growing by $2 or $3, when you're only earning a small amount anyway, it seems like progress and it seems like you've already got a significant nest egg. Mr. Speaker, good governments build countries. This government doesn't. This government can't build the export economy, it can't even build enough houses for people to live in, and it certainly hasn't built the diversity of economic output that we need in order to employ people in well-paid jobs. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.